Hi guys, we're getting near exam time again, and I thought that during that time you're going to be doing a lot more revision, and I thought I'd just bring a quick video about one of the sort of things that gets overlooked a little bit when doing revision on the Cold War. It's one of the topics I quite enjoyed looking at, and I know it's one of those ones that's quite wide-ranging, and you've probably been studying for 2 years now, so I just thought I'd do something to tie that all together and maybe help out in revising for that. The title of this one is Importance of Leaders During the Cold War. And the reason I'm making it is literally just to give you an idea of one thing you might want to revise when you're looking at drawing all your information together. It's something that gets overlooked when you're really sort of busy looking at trying to get everything together. And you're looking at how things interact and certain events interact. It can be quite difficult to look into um, the strategic and slightly more higher level interactions that are going on at the time. So I just thought I'd bring it to your attention. It's just something you might want to consider looking into next time you go back to doing some revision on the Cold War. So you've just finished your course. You're looking at what to revise. You've been told you need to look at themes or possibly even, how certain things tie together. It's a breadth topic, so you're going to get asked a question on across a number of years that you're going to need to tie together. So one really good idea of how you can tie things together on certain questions is to bring in the analysis part of your essay to look at how leaders shape the way the Cold War goes and meanders through 40 years of history. And that works on both sides. So we're just going to have a quick look now at what that really means and what I'm trying to get across. So US presidents, you can see here we're looking at several presidents throughout the Cold War. So 40 years on average, as long as each president serves a full term, which isn't a given. You're looking at 4 years per term. Some get 2 terms. So you're looking at quite a number of presidents that are going to come to power and did come to power during 40 years of Cold War. That has its own issues in many respects because each individual is different. Many times the actual party that the president's been elected on changes from Democrats to Republicans. Their philosophy and the way they view foreign affairs, domestic affairs even, changes very, very differently. And it can also impact on how they individuals might work with the Soviets or not work with the policies they implement against the Soviets. And that can change even in people or presidents that are elected from the same. Two Republicans can still have very, very different ideologies in terms of dealing with the Soviets, especially when you consider that certain presidents have a slightly easier ride domestically than, say, Nixon coming to power during the Vietnam War. They have to pay a lot more attention to internal matters than purely foreign affairs. So we're looking here at presidents churning through. You get to 8 years maximum during this time of a presidency. It's 8 years to interact with a Soviet leader. And so we start with Truman, and you have the ideology from there. You start off with Kennan's letter and the Truman Doctrine, and how that all starts with how we talk about the Cold War starting and progressing during that time. Eisenhower, and you're looking at Asia really during this time, really how different things can be between those two. The difference between having a military general as a president, even to different philosophies that might come about from those. So you're looking really at tying together all the revision notes you've made and thinking about why certain decisions may have been made at certain times or certain policies have come along at certain times. Why would Nixon look to end or be considered peaceful or be seen as the person that ended American involvement in the Vietnam War? Because of domestic reasons. They're not necessarily reasons he held, and you can go revise and check that if that's something you want to think about arguing, is that actually domestic affairs play a large, and public opinion play a large role in how presidents will shape policies and gain public approval for a second term in office, as well as trying to do the right thing for what they're sworn in office to do. Someone like Johnson escalating the war in Vietnam, or Kennedy's dealing of the Cuban Missile Crisis. Is another president able to do what Kennedy manages to do during October '62? They're all questions you can kind of ask yourself, the situations that you end up in with each of these presidents changing really, really quickly. If you think about history in a longer period of time, 8 years isn't a long time to shape policy, to implement policy, when at the end of that time you get someone who's completely different with different thoughts, comes in and changes that policy on a U-turn. So all your summits and talks, what really happens with those, because of how much the president and the man in charge and the philosophy in charge changes. Just one thing to think about when you're looking at these times is to think about who was in charge and why the thing you're looking at happened in the first place, its impact, and for example, NSC 1622, would that have, could that have been continued throughout the rest of the Cold War, or does the fact a new president comes in and changes the idea of moving forward, that actually that doesn't happen? Just US presidents, and you have them churning through really quickly, like we said. We then look at Soviet leaders. These don't change so much. You'll notice there's only one. I've only got these down one side of the slide. They, because of the way the Communist Party works, one leader tends to stay in power for as long as they have the backing of the Politburo, and as long as they stay essentially chairman of the Communist Party. Therefore, you see a lot more stable leadership. So stable in the sense that it's continuous, not necessarily stable in the sense that they implement perfect policies, but they'll be able to cling to power for a lot longer, as long as they're strong. So Khrushchev loses power in '64, basically because of how poorly the Cuban Missile Crisis outcome is perceived to be. And Brezhnev coming to power is there for nearly 20 years, until he's deposed also. Stalin again until his death. Andropov and Chernenko, although they're both short terms, again both till their death. And Gorbachev until '91, when he steps down, was forced to resign. So you have these Soviet leaders who are serve a lot longer terms, because they're not serving terms, they're the leaders of the party for a lot longer, which means that you kind of follow for a rational set of policies with those. For example, Stalin was never going to change the way his policies or anything that he did in terms of foreign relations was never really going to change, because it's one man with his ideology. You'd see maybe a linear graph almost with the way that Stalin would react and do things on the foreign stage, whereas the way that's reacted to might change with the Americans. So all I'm thinking of when you see this list here is just also understand, when you're looking at American presidents, you're possibly looking at the way they would implement proactive policies, and also the way they deal with reactive policies, as being something that can change quite frequently depending on the time you're looking at. Whereas if you take in a Brezhnev or a Stalin, Khrushchev to a point, and Gorbachev in the later years, you've got people serving longer terms, but are much more rational. You could say the Soviets were doing this at that time because Khrushchev was in charge, because Stalin was in charge, because a communist was in charge. The overall ideology isn't changing, like Republicans and Democrats in the Americas. It's just another thing to consider when you're looking at leaders and the impact they have. So this is here for you to pause if you are revising this, or that this is striking as an idea that you might wish to consider when you're doing your revision as another avenue to look down. So I just have a look at the reasons why you would look at the importance of leaders, and why, even if you don't use it as a theme or a way of going through, that actually you would consider just understanding why that's important. For example, you're going to have come across a number of policies, a number of decisions, key decisions, things like the Truman Doctrine, you're going to know as the Truman Doctrine, but why was that implemented? What was its response? How did that affect future policies? Did it affect future policies? You'll get questions such as significant shifts in Eisenhower, or Truman to Eisenhower. Was there a significant shift? Nuclear policy, for example, not something that Truman massively developed between in the late 40s, early 50s, but something that became progressively more important during the arms race. Is that likely to have been a thing that happens under a different president? They're sort of hearsay, so you can't necessarily say, oh well, Kennedy would never have done that. For example, you can't place Kennedy in the early 50s. He wasn't president at that time, but you can understand the importance of the right person or a person being in power at a particular time during particular issues and making certain decisions in the face of adversaries. It will help you also understand why the Cold War went through phases. For example, you have the beginning of the Cold War, if you look at it like that, at the end of the Second World War with no more common enemy. You have the heating up, if you like, of the Cold War, proxy wars and the arms race. You then have détente and the thawing of relations. Things get slightly better, and we have summits, we have some sort of arms limitation talks, and the way that progresses, and then you have almost like a reverse back to how things were before under say Reagan and the Strategic Defense Initiative and things like that, space race in the 60s as well. So things like those, understanding Cold War going through phases because of different leaders being in charge at different times, making different decisions. Why wars entered is, as I mentioned, proxy wars and things like that. Would that have been necessary if just basic ideologies weren't considered at risk by different leaders? Would different leaders have done different? Again, you can't necessarily say Kennedy would never have done this, or Johnson would never have done that, or any of the other presidents. But you understanding that, having that leader, American or Soviet, in power at that time, having a Gorbachev in power in 85 to the end of the 80s, early 90s, is a lot more important when you consider his outlook on life and everything that happened during the late 80s. So much more important when you think if Khrushchev had been in power at that time, do we get the same result? That's quite important, just to consider the importance of having the right people in the right place at the right time. And also, as I touched on a second ago, summits and talks stalling because of leaders and ideologies. The same for the Cold War dragging on as long as it did. So that's there literally to pause if you need to pause to look at that. The things I'd then just say to look at and to think about is the certain exam boards that you're on. AQA, for example, loves to use themes, or likes for students to use themes when they're looking at that. So this is one way of getting that political theme involved. All exam boards also expect wider reading. So why not just incorporate some understanding of the wider, more high level and strategic issues in your answers? It come across as a great piece of analysis, and it will help you score higher marks by just thinking slightly higher and slightly outside of just what's happening on the ground. Any questions, as always, let us know below. Give us a comment. Don't forget to subscribe. New videos every Tuesday on the channel, and good luck with whatever you're revising at the moment. If you have any questions about anything specific, drop them down below. I'll answer as quick as I can. Thank you.